Alguma notícia, Fábio?
Eles ficaram de me avisar, o Fábio está ligando, o Fábio Mariano, que é o assistente dela. Se você talvez, se a gente inverter as ordens, deixar ela para ser a última a falar e a gente começa, não sei o que você acha, Ivo.
Pode ser. Vamos esperar mais um minutinho, falta
Tá bom, sem que eles
2
me derem um
minutinhos.
retorno, tá bom.
Vamos esperar para ver um retorno aí, tá?
Okay.
Nós estamos ao vivo no YouTube. Aviso a todos, we are live on YouTube.
Tá mandando uma mensagem aqui, vamos ver. Ela está tentando entrar, mas o notebook dela pediu uma atualização do Zoom que está em andamento, então, em alguns momentos, ela já está entrando aqui na reunião.
Essa atualização é rápida, viu?
Sim.
Vamos aguardar mais um pouquinho, então.
Legal, então, aguardamos, vai ser rápido.
Vocês não podem perder o show, o concerto que vai ter, viu? De meia horinha, mas é espantoso, muito bom. Hoje eu assisti, muito bem feitinho. Vocês vão gostar, espero que gostem, né? Vamos ver.
Está muito bonito mesmo, a Luciana tem uma voz fantástica.
A soprano que canta, ela foi nossa aluna aí da PUC, fez mestrado na comunicação e semiótica e fez doutorado na Federal do Mato Grosso do Sul, onde ela mora, né? Foi aluna da Heloísa também.
Acho que o doutorado dela foi na USP, professor.
Foi na USP, na ECA.
Ela foi orientada pela Ana May Barbosa.
Sim.
Mas ela é conterrânea minha aqui.
A professora Maria Amália está online.
Ótimo.
Vocês estão me ouvindo?
Boa tarde.
Agora
sim.
Boa tarde, professora.
Foi uma missão hoje, missão cumprida. Atraso, porém cumprida.
Bem-vinda, Amália, bem-vinda. Estávamos aguardando você.
Muito obrigada. Eu sei. Eu hoje de manhã tentamos fazer uma reunião meio de emergência com a direção e não dava certo, o Teams, eu tive que mudar de computador, reinstalei o Teams para me preparar para esta reunião. E aí tive que fazer tudo de novo com o Zoom, porque de vocês é via Zoom. Então eu peço perdão.
Bem-vinda, Amália. Podemos começar, então, né? Já estamos gravando.
Isso.
Vamos lá.
Heloísa, você dá o start aí. A Bárbara começa, né?
Boa tarde, todos e todas. Good afternoon, everyone. É com imenso prazer que damos início a este 21º Encontro Internacional sobre Pragmatismo. Primeiramente, a organização desse encontro agradece a presença das ilustres autoridades acadêmicas que compõem sua mesa de abertura. It is with great pleasure that we begin this 21st International Meeting on Pragmatism. Firstly, the organizing committee of this meeting thanks the presence of the distinguished academic authorities who participated in this opening table. Especialmente, nos honra a presença de nossa magnífica reitora da Pontifícia Universidade Católica de São Paulo, professora doutora Maria Amália Abi Anderi, a quem passamos a palavra neste momento. We are especially honored by the presence of the magnificent rector of the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo, Professor Dr. Maria Amália Pia Bibianderi, to whom we now turn the floor.
Boa tarde a todas e todos. Good afternoon for those who don't speak Portuguese. Eu quero, inicialmente, cumprimentar a todos aqueles que participaram e vêm participando no decorrer dos anos da organização desse encontro tão importante. Eu quero cumprimentar aqui o professor Dr. Ivo Ibri, que é a cabeça pensante e as pernas que trabalham para que esse encontro ocorra, né, já agora na sua 21ª edição. E cumprimentando o professor Ivo, cumprimentar todos aqueles que participaram e vêm participando da organização desse evento. Eu gostaria de salientar que um evento científico de caráter internacional, que abre espaço para aqueles que estão iniciando a carreira numa determinada área, numa determinada linha de trabalho, com um determinado conjunto de problemas em ciência, que abre espaço também para aqueles que estão maduros no auge da sua produção e que consegue, além de tudo isso, manter espaço para apresentar as reflexões daquelas autoridades que no campo específico são representativas do seu campo, e será, em qualquer área, sempre um evento do qual nós só podemos nos orgulhar. E este evento, que é o Encontro Internacional sobre Pragmatismo, agora na sua 21ª edição, tem exatamente essas características. É um evento que se manteve fiel à tradição filosófica à qual se filia, é um evento que se manteve fiel à ideia de abrir espaço, como eu disse, para jovens doutores, jovens estudiosos do campo, de manter o espaço para aqueles que estão no auge da sua carreira e representam o que de mais atual o campo científico ou filosófico representa e que consegue manter nos seus quadros pessoas da estatura do professor Ivo Ibri e dos seus convidados internacionais, é um modelo de evento científico. Esse é o encontro sobre pragmatismo internacional que a PUC tem tido, a PUC São Paulo tem tido a felicidade de trazer para a universidade, graças ao esforço de um grupo muito especial, que é coordenado pelo professor Ivo. Então, é uma enorme satisfação, é um enorme prazer poder sediar esse evento modelar, que deveria servir de modelo para tantas outras áreas de pesquisa. Eu tenho certeza que, mais uma vez, ele será um sucesso. Estava dando uma olhada antes de entrar na programação, e ela é invejável, mesmo para não filósofos, como é o meu caso. Então, mais uma vez, parabéns a todos vocês. Só espero que o próximo encontro possa voltar a ser um encontro face a face. Um encontro, como a gente gosta de dizer, em 3 dimensões, e eu tenho certeza que isso deve voltar a ocorrer. Espero ainda poder abrir mais um encontro antes do encerramento desse mandato de reitoria. Mas tenho certeza que antes ou depois ainda haverá de se festejar o 25º Encontro Internacional sobre Pragmatismo na PUC São Paulo. Professor Ivo, essa é a sua missão, né? Senhores participantes e senhoras participantes do evento, muito sucesso a todos, um evento de excelente qualidade se avizinha, e eu espero que todos possam receber e participar de uma coisa tão importante quanto são os diálogos que a comunidade acadêmica pode proporcionar. Sucesso e muitas felicidades a todos nesse encontro. Um beijo, Ivo.
Obrigado, professor. Muito obrigado.
Na sequência, passamos a palavra para o professor doutor Odair Furtado, representando a Pró-Reitoria de Pós-Graduação da Pontifícia Universidade Católica de São Paulo. Next, we give the floor to Professor Dr. Odair Furtado, representative of the Graduate Pro-Rectory at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo.
Quero cumprimentar inicialmente a magnífica reitora da PUC de São Paulo, professora Maria Amália Pia Bibianderi, ao professor Fábio Cipriano, diretor da Faculdade de Filosofia, Comunicação, Letras e Artes, ao professor Antônio Valverde, coordenador do programa de Filosofia, a professora Lúcia Leão, coordenadora do programa de Comunicação e Semiótica, ao professor Ibri, que é o coordenador deste 21º Encontro Internacional sobre Pragmatismo. Eu acompanho a professora Maria Amália em todos os elogios e considerações que ela fez sobre este importante evento. Eu tenho a felicidade de, mais uma vez, estar aqui representando a Pró-Reitoria. Eu estive, pelo menos, nos 3 anos anteriores, presente aqui representando a Pró-Reitoria, nesse tradicional evento promovido pelos programas de pós-graduação em filosofia e de semiótica, e organizado de uma maneira magnífica pelo professor Ibri, a quem a gente tem que render homenagens por essa sua capacidade, essa insistência, persistência no empenho da realização de um evento com altíssima qualidade como esse Encontro Internacional sobre Pragmatismo. E nesse momento, particularmente, é bastante importante essa insistência em manter um evento com essa qualidade. Nós passamos por momentos difíceis nesses 4 últimos anos em nosso país, vivemos uma destruição sistemática do nosso campo da educação, da saúde e das políticas sociais. E estamos, no momento, suplantando esse momento. Então, é importante a gente ter um campo de qualidade acadêmica resistindo, em primeiro lugar, e apontando para o futuro de dias melhores, em que a gente certamente terá condições de voltar a ter este país com uma melhor educação, com uma melhor saúde, com uma melhor política social. Cumprimento a todos os participantes desse evento, que certamente, como todos os demais, será grandioso. Um grande abraço, Ivo.
Obrigado, professora Odair. Obrigado.
Solicitamos agora a manifestação do professor Dr. Fábio Cipriano, diretor da Faculdade de Filosofia, Comunicação, Letras e Artes, da Pontifícia Universidade Católica de São Paulo. We now request the statement of Professor Dr. Fábio Cipriano, Director of the School of Philosophy, Communications, Languages and Literature and Arts at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo.
Boa tarde. O microfone estava fechado, né? A gente sempre esquece esses detalhes. Mas boa tarde a todas e todos. Eu quero cumprimentar a professora magnífica reitora Maria Amália Pia Bibianderi, e com esse cumprimento a todas as pessoas que estão aqui também, autoridades, mas quero cumprimentar especialmente o professor Ivo, pela organização do evento. Eu acompanho o professor Ivo desde a minha graduação, ele foi meu professor de filosofia no século passado, então é uma grande alegria poder agora estar como diretor da faculdade da FAFICLA, dando a abertura aqui a esse ciclo, com tantas pessoas importantes, representantes de tantas universidades do Brasil, do exterior, Eu vejo que entre os oradores também está o professor Cola Pietro, a quem eu acompanho há muitos anos, participei de encontros na Califórnia também, de semiótica, então, enfim, é realmente uma honra poder dar as boas-vindas a todo esse grupo que foi reunido aqui pelo Ibri, pela comissão organizadora desse evento. Eu acho que existe uma amplitude de programas, de estados, de temas e de autores que são essenciais nesse momento, como disse o professor Adair, né, que nós estamos conseguindo respirar novamente com um certo alívio, quando nós sabemos que vamos poder reconstruir as políticas educacionais, sociais, que estavam sofrendo tanto e que estávamos com tanto risco, mas que eventos como esse, um modelo de evento científico, como a reitora já definiu, são essenciais para nos posicionar, não só a PUC e a organização, mas a todos que estão aqui, né, no papel que a ciência, que a filosofia, que nós temos frente à sociedade. É muito bom, né, que entre os autores que vão ser abordados aqui durante esses dias estejam Anísio Teixeira, Paulo Freire, John Dewey, tantos nomes essenciais, né, para a cultura não só nacional, mas internacional também, e, portanto, é uma honra e uma alegria, então, em nome da FAFICLA, da Faculdade de Filosofia, Comunicação, Letras e Artes da PUC, dar as boas-vindas a todas e ajudar na abertura dessa sessão. Parabéns, Ivo, é muito bom estar aqui com vocês.
Muito obrigado, Fábio. Muito obrigado.
Sequencialmente, ouçamos o professor Dr. Antônio Valverde, coordenador do Programa de Estudos Pós-Graduandos em Filosofia, da Pontifícia Universidade Católica de São Paulo. Sequentially, we listen to Professor Dr. Antônio Valverde, coordinator of the Graduate Program in Philosophy at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo.
Boa tarde a todas e a todos. A coordenação do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Filosofia da PUC saúda todos os participantes do 21º Encontro Internacional sobre o Pragmatismo. Saúda, inicialmente, a professora doutora Maria Amália Pi Habib Anderi, reitora da universidade. O professor doutor Odair Furtado, representante da Pró-Reitoria de Pós-Graduação da universidade. O professor doutor Fábio Cipriano, diretor da FAFICLA. Professor doutor Jônifer Francisco Barbosa, coordenador do curso de Filosofia. Cumprimenta a doutora Lúcia Leão, coordenadora do Programa de Comunicação e Semiótica. E o doutor Ivo Assad Ibri, coordenador do Centro de Estudos sobre Pragmatismo, organizador e coordenador do evento. Saúda também e agradece os colegas professores da Argentina, Colômbia, Estados Unidos da América, Itália e do Brasil pela participação. Saúda e agradece os membros do Centro de Estudos de Pragmatismo pela organização do evento. O 21º Encontro sobre o Pragmatismo aponta para a consolidação dos trabalhos em pesquisa realizados pelo Centro de Estudos do Pragmatismo, de par com as publicações regularíssimas da revista Cognition, reconhecida entre os pares pela excelência acadêmica. Em verdade, os encontros têm dado a ver a vitalidade, a perspicácia e o envolvimento sistemático do Centro de Estudos sobre o Pragmatismo em todas as atividades relativas ao projeto empreendido desde sua fundação. Ao momento em que o programa de pós-graduação em filosofia acaba de ascender no ranking avaliativo de programas da área de filosofia na CAPES, é necessário pontuar que os eventos cumpridos pelo Centro de Estudos de Pragmatismo muito contribuíram para a obtenção, assim como outros eventos da mesma relevância organizados no âmbito do Programa de Filosofia da PUC São Paulo. Por fim, parabenizo o professor Ivo Assad Ibri e os membros do Centro de Estudos de Pragmatismo pelo encontro Hora Aberta. Boas-vindas a todos e excelente encontro.
Muito obrigado, Valverde. Muito obrigado.
Pedimos agora.
Só um segundinho, Bárbara. Alguém está com o microfone aberto, aí está um ruído de fundo. Por favor, olhem todos aí, vê se onde está vindo esse ruído, está um ruído interferindo aí na fala das pessoas. Por favor. Vá em frente, Bárbara.
Pedimos agora que a professora doutora Lúcia Leão, coordenadora do Programa de Estudos Pós-Graduandos em Comunicação e Semiótica, da Pontifícia Universidade Católica de São Paulo, nos dirija a sua palavra. We now ask that Professor Dr. Lúcia Leão, Coordinator of the Graduate Program in Communication and Semiotics at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo, to please address us.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. É uma grande alegria estar aqui, uma honra estar aqui nesse 21º Encontro Internacional sobre Pragmatismo, coordenado pelo nosso querido professor Dr. Ibri, em sua 21ª edição. Estamos muito felizes e queremos iniciar nossa fala saudando a nossa magnífica reitora, professora doutora Maria Amália Pia Abiti Alderi, saudando também o Odair Furtado, Fábio Cipriano, Antônio Valverde e Jennifer Barbosa. Não por acaso estamos vivendo um momento de grande alegria nesse encontro. Paulo Freire, John Dewey, Charles Sanders Peirce, entre outros, são nomes que não só organizam o pensamento de toda a pesquisa em pós-graduação da PUC São Paulo, na área de comunicação e semiótica e também da filosofia, como também têm nos dado forças para resistir e lutar por aquilo que acreditamos. Nossos valores como pesquisadores e também como formadores de novos pesquisadores. Queremos cumprimentar também os pesquisadores nacionais e internacionais que participam desse magnífico encontro. Dar parabéns ao Centro de Estudos sobre o Pragmatismo e também pela organização do evento. Desejamos a todos excelentes encontros, excelentes diálogos e que todos possamos sair dessa oportunidade maravilhosa, transformados e animados em desenvolver futuras pesquisas. Muito obrigada.
Muito obrigado, professora Lúcia. Obrigado.
Ouçamos agora o professor Dr. Jennifer Barbosa, coordenador do curso de graduação em Filosofia da Pontifícia Universidade Católica de São Paulo. Let us now listen to Professor Dr. Jennifer Barbosa, coordinator of the undergraduate program in Philosophy at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo.
Saudações a todos e todas, é um prazer estar aqui com vocês nesse momento. Saúdo a nossa querida reitora e, em nome dela, saúdo a comunidade acadêmica da PUC e dizer que é uma grande alegria nesse dia a gente iniciar esse congresso já consolidado na área, né? Não só nacionalmente, porém internacionalmente. E é um congresso que alia essa consolidação acadêmica de um diálogo importante, rigoroso, analítico com a tradição filosófica, porém sem deixar de lado os impasses, as questões de nosso tempo. Então, quero parabenizar, em especial, o professor Dr. Ibri, por essa organização e todos os organizadores desse evento, e dizer que também é uma satisfação perceber esse chamado a uma integração entre pós-graduação e graduação que o evento hoje realiza. É uma felicidade nossa ver estudantes da graduação presentes, né, como assistentes, ajudando na organização do evento. Então, quero dizer que é uma alegria. E como eu percebi, as legendas elas estão um pouco descalibradas, né? Eu faço uma pequena saudação também aos nossos participantes externos. we would like to thank you everyone and send you a warm welcome for all speakers from other countries and wish you a great event. We are very thankful and honored for your participation. Thanks for being here today and next days. Então, Ivo, parabéns, né? Parabéns a você, a todos os organizadores. Acompanho com muito entusiasmo essa programação feita e que desejo que vocês tenham belíssimos debates nessa semana. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, Jonathan. Obrigado. Em nome de toda a equipe.
Ouçamos, por fim, o professor Dr. Assad Ibri, coordenador do 21º Encontro Internacional sobre Pragmatismo. Finally, let us hear Professor Dr. Assad Ibri, coordinator of the 21st International Meeting on Pragmatism.
Boa tarde a todos, a todas. Em primeiro lugar, eu quero agradecer em meu nome e no da equipe organizadora desse evento a honrosa presença e as palavras sempre gentis e de estímulo de nossa magnífica reitora, professora doutora Maria Amália Pia Habib Amberi, do professor doutor Odair Furtado, pela pró-reitoria de pós-graduação, do professor doutor Fábio Cipriano, diretor da Faculdade de Filosofia, Comunicação, Letras e Artes, do professor doutor Antônio Valverde, do programa de pós-graduação em Filosofia, da professora doutora Lúcia Leão, coordenadora do programa de pós-graduação em Comunicação e Semiótica, e do professor doutor Jonathan Barbosa, coordenador do curso de graduação em Filosofia de nossa universidade. Estamos aqui reunidos para a 21ª edição dos Encontros Internacionais sobre Pragmatismo, que se iniciaram em 1998. Para isso, convidamos conferencistas que já estiveram conosco em encontros passados e que também fazem parte da história do evento, assim como colegas que estão aqui pela primeira vez. Saudemos os professores convidados brasileiros e estrangeiros que estão participando desse 21º encontro. Primeiramente, o professor Robert Innis, da Lowell University, dos Estados Unidos, cuja conferência será de abertura deste encontro, que terei o prazer de comentar. Saudemos os professores conferencistas convidados, Rosa Calcaterra, da Universidade de Roma III, Itália, a professora Maura Istriano, da Universidade Napoli, Frederico II, Itália, os professores David Dewars, da University of New York, Stony Brook, dos Estados Unidos, o professor Vincent Colapetto, da Universidade de Rhode Island, Estados Unidos. Saudemos também os professores que participarão como comentaristas das sessões de conferências que se seguirão após esse dia de abertura, a saber, a professora Lúcia Santaella, da PUC de São Paulo, professora Maria Eunice Ilice Gonçalves e Mariana Broins, ambas da Unesp de Marília, e professor José Crisóstomo de Souza, da Universidade Federal da Bahia. Nesse encontro, vale ressaltar que teremos 4 mesas redondas. A primeira delas, a da Sociedade Latino-Americana PERS, representada pelo grupo de pesquisa da Universidade Nacional de Colômbia, liderado pelo professor Fernando Zelameia, que será uma mesa sobre recentes estudos que estão sendo publicados pelo grupo a respeito da filosofia da matemática de Peirce. Seguir-se-á uma mesa sobre filosofia política por professores da PUC de São Paulo, uma mesa sobre pragmatismo e ética por professores da PUC de São Paulo e da Unesp de Marília, e uma mesa sobre pragmatismo, estética e educação do professor da Universidade Católica de Córdoba, Argentina. Participam das sessões de comunicações, além de inúmeros professores e alunos de vários estados brasileiros, estrangeiros da Argentina, Itália e Estados Unidos. Teremos no último dia do encontro a exposição do livro Dimensions of Aesthetic Encounters, Perception, Interpretation and Design of Art, pelo autor, professor Robert Innis, Keynote Speaker de nosso 21º encontro, e que será comentado pelo professor doutor Arthur Araújo, da Federal do Espírito Santo. Na qualidade de coordenador desse evento, devo prioritariamente agradecer o apoio que recebemos das agências FAPESP e CNPq. Nessa mesma esteira, nosso agradecimento especial pelo suporte a este evento, dado pelos colegas que nominalmente serão mencionados na sequência desta apresentação. Agradecerei no encerramento do encontro nominalmente a todos os integrantes da nossa equipe de trabalho, sem os quais esse evento não se realizaria. Contudo, devo todos, desde já, devemos todos, desde já, agradecer às líderes dessa equipe, professoras Heloísa Guise, da Universidade Federal de Mato Grosso do Sul, e Lúcia Dantas, da Faculdade de São Bento de São Paulo, pelo trabalho extraordinário de organização do evento. Peço, portanto, uma calorosa salva de palmas para elas. Destaco também, em tempo, o imenso talento de nossa designer Raquel Ponte, professora da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. Ela é a brilhante criadora de todo o projeto gráfico desse encontro. Muito obrigado, Raquel, pelo seu sempre talentoso trabalho. Cabe reafirmar que os encontros internacionais sobre pragmatismo da PUC de São Paulo, que nesse ano de 2022 completa 24 anos de vida, alcançaram um prestígio acadêmico nacional e internacional que tem justificado o imenso trabalho que sua organização demanda, envolvendo o esforço de toda uma equipe por praticamente 12 meses do ano. Esse 21º encontro, pela segunda vez em formato remoto, por efeito da pandemia por que passamos, malgrado nos privarmos do rico intercâmbio acadêmico e humano que sempre desfrutamos ao longo dessas mais de 2 décadas, busquemos desfrutar do aprendizado de novas e inspiradas ideias que ele certamente irá trazer. A todos, com muita alegria, desejo um ótimo encontro internacional de pragmatismo. E auguramos que no ano vindouro de 2023, como disse a nossa querida reitora, possamos estar juntos novamente, dessa vez presencialmente. Muito obrigado.
Agora, antes de finalizarmos nossa abertura, desfrutemos de um programa musical, com voz da soprano Luciana Fischer, acompanhada da pianista Ana Paula Ferreira, do acordeonista Renan Nonato e do violinista Edson Verbisky. Now, before we finish our opening, let us enjoy a musical program with the voice of the soprano Luciana Fischer, accompanied by pianist Ana Paula Ferreira, accordeonist Renan Nonato, and violinist Edson Verbisky. Primeiramente, vamos ouvir o hino nacional. First, let us hear the national hymn, seguido de 7 peças musicais, followed by 7 musical pieces. Bis du bei mir, do Bach, Lascia que eu pianga, do Handel, Melodia Sentimental, do Villa-Lobos, Oblivion, do Piazzolla, Body and Soul, do Green, Heyman, Sauer e Eiton, O que tinha de ser, do Tom Jobim e Vinícius de Moraes, e Alfonsina e El Mar, de Ramírez e Luna.
voz de povo heróico, brado retumbante, e o sol da liberdade em raios fúlgidos brilhou no céu da pátria neste instante. Seu penhor dessa igualdade conseguimos conquistar com braço forte. Em teu seio, ó liberdade, desafia o nosso peito à própria morte. Ó pátria amada, idolatrada, salve, salve. Brasil, sonho intenso, raio vívido de amor e de esperança a terra desce. Sim, teu formoso céu risonho e límpido, a imagem do cruzeiro resplandece. Gigante pela própria natureza, és bela, és forte, impávido colosso, e o teu futuro espelha essa grandeza. Terra adorada, entre outras mil, és tu, Brasil, ó pátria amada. Dos filhos deste solo és mãe gentil, pátria amada, Brasil. Deitada eternamente em berço esplêndido, ao som do mar, à luz do céu profundo, fulguras, ó Brasil, florão da América, iluminado ao som do novo mundo. Do que a terra mais garrida, teus risonhos, lindos campos têm mais flores, nossos bosques têm mais vida, nossa vida no teu seio mais amores. Ó pátria amada, idolatrada, salve, salve. Brasil de amor eterno, seja símbolo, o lábaro que ostentas estrelado, e diga ao verde louro desta flâmula, paz no futuro e glória no passado. Mas se ergues da justiça a clava forte, verás que filho teu não foge à luta, nem teme quem te adora a própria morte. Terra adorada, entre outras mil, és tu, Brasil, ó pátria amada. Dos filhos deste solo és mãe gentil, pátria amada, Brasil. Bist du bei mir, geh ich mit Freude, sonst sterben und zu meiner Ruhe, sonst sterben und zu meiner Ruhe. Bist du bei mir, geh ich mit Freude, sonst sterben und zu meiner Ruhe, sonst sterben und zu meiner Ruhe. Ach, wie vergnügt, wer soll mein Ende? Es drückt in deine schönen Hände mir die getreuen Augen zu. Ach, wie vergnügt, wer soll mein Ende? Es drückt in deine schönen Hände mir die getreuen Augen zu. Bist du bei mir, geh ich mit Freude, cruna sorte e che sospiri a libertà. sad and lonely. For you I sigh, for you, dear only. Why haven't you seen it? I'm all for you, body and soul. I spend my days in longing and wondering why it's me you're wronging. I tell you I mean it. I'm all for you, body and soul. I can't believe it. It's hard to conceive it that you'll turn away romance. Are you pretending it looks like the ending? Unless I could have one more chance to prove, dear, my life a wreck you're making. You know I'm yours for just a taking. I'd gladly surrender myself to you, body and soul. My life a wreck you're making. You know I'm yours for just a taking. I'd gladly surrender myself to you, body and soul. Myself to you, body and soul. Porque foste na vida a última esperança. Encontrar-te me fez criança. Porque já eras meu, sem eu saber sequer. Porque és o meu homem e eu tua mulher. Porque tu me chegaste sem me dizer que vinhas, e tuas mãos foram minhas com calma. Porque foste em minha alma como um tinha de ser. Porque foste na vida a última esperança, encontrar-te me fez criança, porque já eras meu, sem eu saber sequer, porque és o meu homem e porque tu me chegaste sem me dizer que vinhas, e tuas mãos foram minhas com calma, porque foste em minha alma como um amanhecer, porque foste o que tinha de ser. Por la blanda arena que lame el mar, su pequeña huella no vuelve más. Un sendero solo de pena y silencio llegó hasta el agua profunda. Un sendero solo de penas mudas llegó hasta la espuma. Sabe Dios que angustia te acompañó, que dolores viejos cayó tu voz para recostarte arrullada en el canto de las caracolas marinas, la canción que canta en el fondo oscuro del mar, la caracola. Te vas, Alfonsina, con tu soledad, que poemas nuevos fuiste a buscar, una voz antigua de viento y de sal te requiebre el alma y la está llevando, y te vas hacia allá como en sueño. luz de algas e de coral e fosforescentes caballos marinhos harão uma ronda a tu lado e los habitantes del agua van a jugar pronto a tu lado. Bájame la lámpara un poco más, déjame que duerma nodriza en paz. Y si llama a él, no le digas que estoy, dile que Alfonsina no vuelve. Y si llama a él, no le digas nunca que estoy, di que me he ido. Devas, Alfonsina, con tu soledad, que poemas nuevos fuiste a buscar, una voz antigua de viento y de sal, te requiebre el alma y la está llevando, y te vas hacia allá como en sueños, dormida Alfonsina, vestida de mar.
Espero que todos tenham gostado. A Luciana é espetacular, a voz dela é uma coisa extraordinária. Foi nossa aluna. É isso aí.
Após essa belíssima programação musical, é com prazer que damos por encerrada nossa cerimônia de abertura e oficialmente iniciamos o 21º Encontro Internacional sobre Pragmatismo. Agradecimentos especiais pelo apoio à Campanella, Sociedade de Advogados, Ideia Viva, Escola de Cultura, D'Artagnan Vasconcelos Júnior, José Luiz Zanetti, Júlia de Oliveira e Vera Maria Zugato. After this wonderful musical program, it is with pleasure that we conclude the opening ceremony and officially start the 21st International Meeting on Pragmatism. Agora, convidamos a todos para a conferência de abertura. Muito obrigada. Now, we invite everyone to join our keynote lecture. Thank you.
Essa sessão será coordenada pelo professor, nosso querido professor Edelcio, né, que vai, então, fazer a introdução da sessão. Com a palavra, Edelcio.
Obrigado.
Todos me ouvem bem?
Sim, sim.
Sim.
Hi, everybody. At first, I would like to say that's an honor for me to be a chair of this opening session in this meeting at PUC São Paulo. All of you knows that it was in this university that I learned to be a professor. So I would like to thank Professor Ivo for this invitation. Okay, let's go. Our keynote speaker will be Professor Robert Innis from University of Massachusetts at Lowell, United States of America. The title of conference is The Paradoxical Burden of Originality and Creativity. Professor Innis, it's really a pleasure to see you again in this meeting. Thank you. It's up to you.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity once again to be together with all of my friends who I've now been with for the last 10 years or more, with these incredibly wonderful beginnings, and let's hope with wonderful continuations and endings. My talk is on the paradoxical burden of creativity and originality. It's almost an example of what it's about, namely of many years of being perplexed about how one could say something new in the light of the fact that one had a terrible feeling that everything had been already said before. So I began reflecting upon this, and this is the result of those reflections. The talk is divided into 4 sections: framing, creativity and originality. Second section deals with what lies underneath, what is beneath creativity and originality. The third section deals with some examples, both outside of philosophy and connected with philosophy. And then there is a very small conclusion that has something very close to my heart, namely a musical example, which is only going to be mentioned and talked about, but as an example of creativity that illustrates what my talk has itself been about. So here we go. In Goethe's Maxims and Reflections, we find the following linked entries. The most original authors of the day are not rated as such because they produce something new, but only because they are capable of saying this kind of thing as though it had never been said before. That is why the most attractive mark of originality is knowing how to develop a received idea so creatively that no one can easily guess how much lies hidden within it. As to these ideas, whatever they may be, such as, for example, creativity and originality themselves, many ideas appear only quite gradually, like flowers, opening out among the greenery of the branches, says Goethe. Such attitudes are essentially habits, and habits arise from a continuous train of practices. And since that is the case, can the production of original ideas be practiced or cultivated? What is involved in such practices, such as reading or copying or training or being instructed? For Goethe, the greatest genius is not worth much if he pretends to draw exclusively from his own resources. Genius, in this sense, and intended by Goethe, is the faculty of seizing and turning to account anything that strikes us. Indeed, he contended that closely scrutinized, the productions of artistic genius are for the most part reminiscences. As he wrote in another entry of Maxims and Reflections, there is nothing clever that hasn't been thought of before. You just have to think it all over again. Thinking something all over again is one of the permanent marks of a philosophical reflection and the practices of life that accompany and inform it. My task on this occasion, a philosophical meeting on pragmatism, is to think over or rotate creativity and originality, clearly general and multidimensional notions of great and contentious breadth and depth, encompassing not just philosophical theorizing, but also the creativity of action and its diverse contexts. But even here, Goethe issues a stark warning. General notions and great conceit are always potential creators of shocking misfortune. As Goethe also remarked, one can recognize the usefulness of an idea and yet fail to understand just how to make the best use of it. But here Goethe notes, we encounter a double-faced problem or challenge. All empiricists are on the search for ideas and cannot discover them in multiplicity. All theorists are looking for them in multiplicity and fail to discover them there. This contrast between empiricists and theorists characterizes central aspects of the task of finding ways to frame an approach to and exemplify creativity and originality as both a task and a burden. We are urged on every front to be creative, to find our own original voice, to say something new about vitally important topics, to speak out from where we are in ways not heard before, to produce works of art and take on agencies that shift the relational context, both individual and social, in which we carry out our lives. But Goethe, in spite of his remarkable creative and intellectual powers, makes no attempt to turn creativity and originality into some sort of fetishistic demand that we have to fulfill by a kind of liberating exercise of autonomous thought or artistic production or ethical actions, paradoxically by freeing ourselves by prior instances of them in a conscious pursuit of novelty. For Goethe, we are never entirely free, nor should we strive to be. We find similar linked remarks in Emerson, provoked by his encounter with and deep admiration for Goethe. Emerson was himself famously absorbed in the problem of originality and creativity. In one of his well-known passages, which may initially seem to differ from Goethe's remarks, Emerson asked, "Why should we not have an original relation to the universe? Why should we not have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion of revelation to us and not the history of theirs?" In his book, First We Read, Then We Write, Emerson on the Creative Process, Robert Richardson writes that Emerson wanted original accounts, firsthand experience, personal witness, insisting at the same time that Emerson did not deny new thoughts or the original contributions of others. They were to be measured by how much they could give back to one's own consciousness. Such thoughts and contributions arise from the type of activity, both receptive and productive, that is the work or workings of genius, an activity, Emerson asserts, which repairs the decays of things. Paradigmatically, the decays of our vital sense of life, both social and individual, the decay of comity, of the respect for truth, and of the sense of a common good. This is the type of writing and practices of reading that Emerson himself engaged in, with his lifelong attempts to write against the pressing weight of his realization, growing out of his encounters with Shakespeare, Goethe, and others, that all originality is relative. Every thinker is retrospective, not in the sense that the past is the explicit focus of their thinking, but rather that it furnishes the unavoidable background, enabling conditions and analytical resources upon which the thinker relies to focus on the present. Dewey, in Arctic's experience, calls this condition fundedness, the capital the mind has at its disposal to engage the world, an active and eager background that lies in wait and engages whatever comes its way so as to absorb it into its own being. Its animus is toward further interactions and thus against closure. In the opening lines of his essay on Shakespeare, Emerson makes the claim, great men are more distinguished by range and extent than by originality. The greatest genius is the most indebted man. Such indebtedness makes a mockery of our petulant demand for originality, from which we need to be freed. We have, he writes, a permanent debt to tradition through reading and conversation, and thus there is no, and that there is no pure originality. All minds quote, old and new make the warp and woof of every moment. There is no thread that is not a twist of these two strands. By necessity, by proclivity, and by delight, we all quote. So what is originality for Emerson? It is being oneself, and reporting accurately what we see and are, he says. Genius, that is, genius in the sense of one's own guiding spirit, is, in the first instance, sensibility, the capacity of receiving just impressions from the external world, and the power of coordinating these after the laws of thought. In this respect, Emerson concurs with Goethe's foregrounding of an attentive openness to what strikes, lures, and inspires one. Scientific originality is a distinctive and highly developed example of this. And it is also linked and differently focused from, which is differently linked and focused from art. Rosamund Harding, in her classic study, An Anatomy of Inspiration, provocatively proposed that while the scientist creates a discovery, the artist discovers a creation. In this way, linking science and art as pathways to discovery and exemplifications of creativity. If then, as Emerson holds, the greatest genius, no matter in what field, is the most indebted man, this places a heavy burden on creators and discoverers, as well as on those who undergo or encounter in multiple ways their products, scientific theories, philosophical speculations and analyses, works of art of all sorts, as well as novel forms of life practices and their institutions. They all arise against the background of previous works, received ideas and theories and forms of life, and with both their support as well as their opposition. The nature of this background goes beyond art and theoretical construction to the whole domain of creative making, thinking, and doing quite generally. Each artwork or novel theory or ethical proposal or heroic action, independent of scale, makes a claim on our attention as a possible unique and worthwhile instance of a kind of thing. The interpreter-perceiver must avoid engaging artworks with mere nodding recognition or by imposing a template of prior experiences and the embedded habits of attending that have come to inform as well as enrich us on many levels. And the scientist and experimenter, observer, or writer or artist is expected to show that their products are truly novel in some way, even if they do not break the framework they are operating in, but nevertheless advance it. Goethe's and Emerson's way of framing the conditions of creativity and originality seem to both demystify it and to acknowledge it as an ideal, while simultaneously holding it, in Emerson's case, to be a petulant demand that in a paradoxical way traps us and binds us. What Goethe and Emerson share, however, is commitment to a concept of creativity or originality as a free form of thought, action, and self-formation, while admitting at the same time that it is inextricably bound to its background and enabling conditions. It is not reified, nor is it subject to direct control. What lies beneath originality and creativity? Can we specify in more detail their background and enabling conditions? Does pragmatism in some form offer conceptual tools for at least clarifying, if not fully answering these questions? Consider the phenomenologically rich passage about these conditions from Dewey's Art as Experience. I think you may have to go a little bit further in the text. I cut out one about 15 lines. Good, very good. New ideas come leisurely, yet promptly to consciousness only when work has previously been done in forming the right doors by which they may gain entrance. Subconscious maturation precedes creative production in every line of human endeavor. The direct effort of wit and will of itself never gave birth to anything that is not mechanical. Their function is necessary, but it is to let loose allies that exist outside their scope. At different times, we brood over different things. We entertain purposes that, as far as consciousness is concerned, are independent, being each appropriate to its own occasion. We perform different acts, each with its own particular result. Yet, as they all proceed from one living creature, they are somehow bound together below the level of intention. They work together, and finally something is born, almost in spite of conscious personality, and certainly not because of its deliberate will. When patience has done its perfect work, the man is taken possession of by the appropriate muse and speaks and sings as some god dictates. Does this passage not have a close connection with Peirce's remark that the deeper working of spirit or psyche take place in their own way and their own slow way, without our contrivance, and also with Peirce's characterization of consciousness as a bottomless lake, with its reference to certain influences, a topic explored with nuance and precision by our friend Ivo in his essay on the bottomless lake of firstness. Peirce writes, I think of consciousness as a bottomless lake whose waters seem transparent, yet into which we can clearly see but a little way. But in this water, there are countless objects at different depths, and certain influence will give certain kinds of those objects an upward impulse, which may be intense enough and continue long enough to bring them into the upper visible layer. After the impulse ceases, they commence to sink downwards. These certain influences clearly entail charged dynamic fields of association and linkages that operate behind our backs and that may have been built up over a lifetime of experiences and practices and thereby fund our diverse life practices. The bearing of such phenomenologically rich passages must not be restricted to canonical artistic or creative processes or philosophical reflection and writing. It also encompasses a description of how in dialogical situations of everydayness or in professional context, we find new and right words pulled out of us that fit the previously unarticulated or are inadequately articulated thing meant that we are striving to grasp. Indeed, the educational pedagogical task for schools, for example, is to recognize the ground, both stable and shifting, that has to be prepared and cultivated, even for the process of waiting for or allowing the eminent and luring insight to occur. A second text from Dewey's Artist Experience moves us to a deeper level of creative non-practice, another element in the dialogical depth grammar of creativity that is exemplified in art and in theoretical and mathematical discovery, but by no means restricted to them. Dewey writes, I do not think that it can be denied that an element of reverie, of approach to a state of a dream, enters into the creation of a work of art, nor that the experience of the work, when it is intense, often throws one into a similar state. Indeed, it is safe to say that creative conceptions in philosophy and science come only to persons who are relaxed to the point of reverie. The subconscious fund of meaning stored in our attitudes have no chance of release when we are practically or intellectually strained, for much of the greater part of this store is then restrained because the demands of a particular problem and particular purpose inhibit all except the elements directly. Images and ideas come to us not by set purpose, but in flashes, and flashes are intense and illuminating. They set us on fire only when we are free from special preoccupations. A third Dewey passage bears upon another aspect of the nature and scope of alterity or otherness in the dialogical grammar of creativity, the engagement with the other in multiple senses of the word, whether physical materials, texts, prior works of art, patterns of behavior, and so forth. Dewey writes, with respect to the physical materials that enter into the formation of a work of art, everyone knows that they must undergo change. Marble must be chipped, pigments must be laid on canvas, words must be put together. It is not so generally recognized that a similar transformation takes place on the side of inner materials, images, observations, memories, and emotions. They are also progressively reformed. They too must be administered. This modification is the building up of a truly expressive act. The impulsion that sees as a commotion demanding utterance must undergo as much and as careful management in order to receive eloquent manifestation as marble or pigment, as colors and sounds. Nor are they, in fact, two operations, one performed upon the outer material and the other upon the inner and mental stuff. The work is artistic in the degree in which the two functions of transformation are effected by a single operation. As the painter places pigment upon the canvas or imagines it placed there, his ideas and feeling are also ordered. As the writer composes and his medium of words what he wants to say, his ayah takes on for himself perceptible form. In this process of interaction with materials, inner and outer, semiotic and non-semiotic, and the development of expressive forms or utterance, Dewey holds that the self is modified beyond acquisition of greater facility and skill. Interaction is a process of sedimentation, resulting in a deposit of meaning, involving formation of habits, attitudes, and interests, as Goethe claimed. Dewey, as I have noted, calls this condition fundedness, a kind of experiential capital that is constitutive of the self and supports the self's multiple dimensions of noting and caring for things and setting life purposes. Dewey considers this fundedness of experience to be the key to mind, which he calls the background upon which every new contact with surroundings is projected, a notion close to Goethe's and Dewey's connecting of assimilation and responsive reconstruction. This background is not a passive screen. Experience, Dewey claims, is a dynamic spiral of assimilation and reconstruction of both background and of what is taken in and digested. The multidimensional experiential field is a range of material resistances and affordances of oppositional tensions that stimulate the imagination, functioning as enabling conditions for arriving at novel, satisfactory consummations, whether affective, practical, aesthetic, political, educational, theoretical, and so forth. Creativity and originality are grounded in and arise in these further interactions that take many forms as several further exemplifications and extensions of the dynamics of the immanent dynamics of creative dependency and achievement of such interactions show. Here are several exemplifications and extensions. Using the language of alchemy, James Elkins, in his What Painting Is, has given a strong and at times bewildering, but certainly challenging meditation on the materiality of painting. His focus, like Nigel Wentworth's in The Phenomenology of Painting, is on the act of painting, the kinds of thoughts that are taken to be embedded in paint itself. Paint records the most delicate gesture and the most tense gesture. Painting is an unspoken and largely unrecognized dialogue, he writes, where paint speaks silently in masses and colors, and the artist responds in moods. Indeed, Elkins continues, the meanings embedded in paintings preserve the motions that generate them, perhaps analogous to writers' drafting and redrafting of text, an experience quite similar, or quite familiar, familiar to all of us. Painters, he says, can sense these motions in the paint, even before they notice what the paintings are about. And so can the properly attuned perceivers of the paintings and writers and readers of text. Wentworth gives a nuanced and convincing defense and illustration of the thesis of Peirce and Dewey that each material has its own qualitative nature. His analysis of the intertwining of brush, paint and gesture as material supports of pictorial meaning is complicated by a fine account of the plastic elements, such as color, line, tone, texture, form, and composition that function on the border between the semiotic and the only seemingly non-semiotic, as well as between expression and figuration. Verbal art, though admittedly with a different feel, is also embedded in and impermeated by language's paradoxical materiality, which is likewise wedded to the semiotic power of abstract distancing, as Stanley Burnshaw explored in his wonderful book on the seamless web. Moreover, in his book Making, the cultural anthropologist Tim Ingold writes of an improvisatory creativity that works things out as it goes along, in contrast to the attribution of creativity to the novelty of determinate ends conceived in advance, ends which only have to be methodically realized. Dewey made the same point in a text cited earlier, that language-mediated dialogues exhibit such an improvisatory character too, even in the domain of inner speech, as the Russian psychologist Vygotsky showed in the flow of word and counterword and the felt traces of contrary tendencies in the field of consciousness, which William James also noted. Clearly, there are times when the ends are determinate by reason of an experimentally foreseen or predicted interaction of materials. And there are also times when the end is only attained when one recognizes that a process of interaction has come to a conclusion and feels right, or corresponds to a sense of completion, such as finding the right word to dissolve what seems a radical disagreement and thereby create a sense of unity and comity or togetherness as a social bond, or the realization that a poem, essay, or book is finished, or the last stroke applied to a canvas or line drawn on paper. Or there can be no sense of completion, but one of fracture or rupture or blockage. Ingold argues with the wealth of examples that making, in the sense in which he is using the term, must be understood longitudinally as a confluence of forces and materials, a form-generating or morphogenetic process. Ingold thinks of both organisms and artifacts in dynamic terms as growing, as embodied matrices of processes. What an organism has in mind is, to be sure, quite different from the varying degrees of human involvement in the making of an artifact. But Ingold makes an indispensable point when he writes, even if the maker has a form in mind, it is not this form that creates the work. It is engagement with materials. This is also the case of speech and its essentially dialogical structure that is extended in the writing process. Language involves active transformation of material, funded semiotic material that supports and mediates the utterance that is appropriate and fitting to the dialogical situations in which we find ourselves and engage one another, whether writer, artist, architect, teacher, politician, parent, or lecturer at a philosophy conference. For Ingold, as for Dewey, learning is understanding in practice, exploring the interrelations between perception, creativity, and skill. Is not the fostering of creativity and originality dependent on developing frameworks for various practices, educational, political, communal, and so forth, that aim principally at the development of perception and skill and not explicitly or directly at creativity? The perceived ongoing possibilities of materials in the broadest sense and of dialogical encounters with them in diverse situations, both singularly and in groups, provoke self-reflection on their successes and on the interruptions and lack of focus attendant upon their failure. Such skills involve what Michael Polanyi called tacit knowing and entail a subsidiary, not focal knowledge of the maxims, not the rules, but the maxims that inform our activities and how we manage to go on with them, with an accompanying sense of being on the right track toward a known unknown. Ingold, in a discussion of building, and early society refers to what he calls the creativity of messy practices that give rise to real buildings, a theme treated with concrete nuance by Juhani Pallasmaa in his book, The Thinking Hand. Architecture, he writes, is a product of the knowing hand. The hand grasps the physicality and materiality of thought and turns it into a concrete image. And the arduous processes of designing, the hand often takes the lead, he says, in probing for a vision, a vague inkling that it eventually turns into a sketch, a materialization of an idea. Messy practices mark the whole realm of dialogical interactions, whether social, political, intellectual, and so forth, which have a dynamic and often unstable center and a field of forces. Messy practices involve starting and stopping, interruptions, extended pauses, diversions, attempts at domination and control, and so forth. Indeed, texts, ordered conversations, works of art, democracy and the institutions and practices of schooling emerge out of and are examples of such messy practices. We might like to think that they were very different, but unfortunately they're not. These practices are always confronted by what Polanyi in another context referred to as a logical gap between where one is situated and where one is heading to, although one cannot get a firm grip on it before crossing the gap. In such situations, which mark life itself, crossing the gap is not principally a feat of operative action, but an event into which we are caught up and to which we can, indeed must, accommodate ourselves. Creativity is clearly also a process involving our being embodied and caught up in dynamic heuristic fields of forces. Looked at semiotically, it is the outcome of activity undertaken in already formed cultural meaning fields, including fields of materials and material objects whose possibilities afford as well as resist creative transformations by technology and the arts. Looked at practically, it is a field of possible and appropriate social actions, including the core political and educational context of our lives. But creativity in its event character, as the occurrence of a new insight, often described as an aha experience, seems at times, or even mostly, to spring from nowhere. Some have described this nowhere as the unconscious, or as we saw in Dewey's case, the subconscious, perhaps a more neutral term. Creativity as an event cannot be willed or controlled, although there are certain practices of various sorts that facilitate it. It cannot be constructed like a house or a wall or from a plan worked out in detail beforehand. Even these plans become embroiled in messy practices in being realized. As Dewey warns with general intent in Art as Experience, a rigid determination of an end product, whether by artist or beholder, leads to the turning out of a mechanical or academic product. Here's the last two paragraphs. While preparing this paper, I encountered a sentence about the pianist, the French pianist Hélène Grimaud, that captures another aspect of the bound nature of creativity that perhaps applies to all of us who are connected with the world of Homo academicus, with its complex relations between teaching established contents and the putative production of new ideas and relations between them. The sentence is this: she has this willingness to take a piece of music apart and free herself from the general body of practice that has grown up around it. The music world, in its great diversity, has come to distinguish multiple worlds, multiple roles for its practitioners. There are composers, performers, and conductors, and instrument makers. These roles clearly can be fused in certain circumstances and have a long history of shifting relations and ascription of status. In Grimaud's case, as performer and interpreter, such freeing is paradoxically only possible by reason of her own critical appropriation of this general body of practice. These practices involve performances, which realize in novel ways an identifiable work, which is always in some ways constrained, as in her transfixing performance of Busoni's transcription of Bach's Chaconne in D minor, which I would recommend everybody to access on YouTube. It's the most amazing performance you could ever imagine. In our broad philosophical, scientific, artistic endeavors, are we not challenged to take apart by attentive, critical appropriation the vitally important topics we are drawn to, locating them in this general body of often messy practices out of which they have emerged and been shaped, and thereby giving voice to them in new ways? Is this not the type of task imposed on us by the paradoxical, even petulant demand for recognition and of an intrinsically indebted originality and creativity? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Innis. Now we have the comments of Professor Ivo Ibri, please.
Eu vou falar em português, meu comentário, vou ler, e vai ser projetado em inglês, como a gente sempre faz. Então, eu começo dizendo que é um privilégio para mim. Pode mudar o slide aí. É um privilégio para mim estar mais uma vez ao lado do professor Innis para comentar um ensaio seu. Quero, de início, agradecer sua participação em muitos dos nossos encontros, marcando-os com brilhantismo e profundidade intelectual, sempre generosamente partilhados com muitos de nós que admiramos o seu profícuo trabalho. Eu passo, então, de imediato aos meus comentários. Diante da tarefa que nos é imposta, gente de empreendimentos filosóficos, científicos, artísticos, baseados na dura e complexa exigência da originalidade, é preciso ter em mente, argumenta o professor Innis, que a criatividade, como evento, não pode ser meramente desejada ou controlada, embora existam certas práticas de vários tipos que a possibilitam. Como, pois, como adverte Goethe, não a partir de recursos próprios, posicionar-se na tensão entre o passado e o futuro, na genial absorção que possui, eu cito aqui, através do professor Innis, a faculdade de aprender e dar conta de tudo o que nos atinge. Tal como lembra o professor Innis dos escritos de Goethe, mergulhar na reminiscência pela arte da apropriação, já que não há nada inteligente, ele cita Goethe, não há nada inteligente que não tenha sido pensado antes. Bastaria, então, repensar tudo. Na visão de Emerson, na palavra do professor Innis, todo pensador é retrospectivo. Não no sentido como o professor Innis aponta, de que o passado é o foco explícito do pensamento, mas sim que fornece o fundo inevitável, condições propícias e recursos analíticos sobre os quais o pensador depende de se concentrar no presente, de modo que originalidade é ser a si mesmo e relatar com precisão o que vemos e somos. Isso, segundo Emerson, na palavra do professor Innis. O gênio, escreve Emerson na palavra de Innis, repousa na capacidade de receber apenas impressões do mundo externo e no poder de coordená-las de acordo com as leis do pensamento. Assim, o gênio surge no pano de fundo de obras anteriores, ideias e teorias recebidas, em modos de vida, tanto com seu apoio quanto com sua oposição, em meio ao atrito que, pela fecundidade passageira, faz prosperar a novidade. Como apresenta o professor Innis, elucidando o aspecto paradoxal presente no título de sua apresentação, Sem essa herança, ou seja, trabalhos anteriores, ideias e teorias recebidas e modos de vida, não podemos ir além dela. Mas permanecer nela pode me levar a uma situação estática e ao beco sem saída da mera repetição. Como continua o professor Innis, as formas de Goethe e Emerson de enquadrar as condições de criatividade e originalidade parece tanto desmitificá-las quanto reconhecê-las como um ideal, enquanto, simultaneamente, no caso de Emerson, sua demanda nos limita e nos aprisiona. O que ambos os autores compartilham, segundo o professor Innis, é um compromisso com o conceito de criatividade, de originalidade como forma livre de pensamento, ação e autoformação, como afirma Dewey em Art as Experience. Citando o Dewey, através do professor Innis, o esforço direto da sagacidade e da vontade, fecha aspas, por si só, nunca deu origem a nada que não seja mecânico, embora admitindo que está inextricavelmente ligado aos seus antecedentes e condições facilitadoras. O professor Innis menciona que se pode ver uma conexão de tais considerações com a observação de Peirce, segundo a qual, ele cita Peirce, os trabalhos mais profundos do espírito ou psique ocorrem em sua própria maneira lenta, sem nossa intervenção. E também ele continua com a caracterização da consciência por Peirce como um lago sem fundo, metáfora extremamente rica sobre a qual publiquei um ensaio recente. O professor Innis explica que Dewey situa no conceito de interação, este definido como um processo de sedimentação, resultando em depósito de sentido, envolvendo a formação de hábitos e interesses, a compreensão da experiência como uma espiral dinâmica de assimilação e reconstrução do fundo, do que é limitado, assimilado e digerido. Essa seria a condição de possibilidade do chamado capital experiencial, que constitui e sustenta o eu em suas múltiplas dimensões, consolidando um passo de fundo sobre o qual se projeta cada novo contato com o meio. Tal condição concebe a criatividade como um processo que envolve nosso corpo aprisionado em campos de força heurísticos, dinâmicos, mesmo que a criatividade pareça, às vezes, ou mesmo principalmente, surgir do nada. Após essas considerações, em que tentei resumir alguns pontos principais do texto do professor Innis, gostaria de destacar alguns pontos principais do texto. Gostaria de destacar alguns aspectos teóricos que acho muito interessantes comentar e propor algumas questões que nos surgiram à mente. Na página 2 do texto, o professor Innis realça uma passagem de Goethe, que eu traduzi para o português. Diz Goethe: pode-se reconhecer a utilidade de uma ideia e ainda assim não entender como fazer o melhor uso dela. Mas aqui, observa Goethe, encontramos um problema ou desafio enfrentado por Janus. Todos, Janus, aquele deus romano de dupla face, diz Goethe, todos os empiristas estão em busca de ideias e não podem descobri-las na multiplicidade. Todos os teóricos as procuram na multiplicidade e falham em descobri-las lá. A palavra de Goethe. Então, é válido enfatizar esse problema, ainda é válido enfatizar esse problema da dupla face de Janus, depois que Kant apontou os pontos fracos das escolas empirista e racionalista, a saber, a cegueira heurística da primeira e o vazio cognitivo da segunda. Em outros termos, após o esforço kantiano de conciliar as duas escolas, definitivamente, a meu ver, pelo menos no que diz respeito às ciências, esse problema do dualismo ainda teria sentido. De outro lado, parece-me que as inspiradas passagens de diversos autores convocados pelo artigo do professor Innis orbitam em torno do enigma de como criatividade e originalidade podem, de fato, trazer ideias criativas e originais de um modo que não sejam presas ao passado e não se iludam em produzir algo novo que, de fato, não o é. Uma questão surge aqui e penso valeria a pena ser objeto de reflexão, a saber, a de que criatividade e originalidade não podem ser operações da mente ex nihilo, e que elas se alimentam do repertório de signos disponível na área em que operam. Parece importante entendermos o passado como repertório cultural. E, sem dúvida, isso deve ser levado em conta para que o novo, o original, assim o sejam por contraste com o conhecimento já vigente. Beethoven, por exemplo, tinha um imenso repertório de teoria musical e, dentro do classicismo, criou uma vasta obra musical. Não se libertou nem de ideias anteriores, nem da escola vigente em música, mas combinou os signos disponíveis de maneira original. Ele inovou, inclusive, um repertório de signos musicais ao compor os seus quartetos de cordas, na época considerados como estranhamente dissonantes pela crítica, e que já anunciavam traços do atonalismo que se seguiria na passagem da música erudita do fim do século XIX ao início do século XX. Assim, gostaria de ouvir o professor Innis sobre esse ponto. Não seria, por um lado, a criação de signos novos uma possível combinação inédita de signos já disponíveis, ou mesmo o resultado de experimentos abdutivos, seja em arte ou em ciência, cujos percursos na história passam por processos bem diferentes. Um outro ponto que me parece interessante é que, ao longo do texto, há uma linha de reflexão, maiormente trazida por Dewey, de que o estado criativo da mente deve apenas se livrar de preocupações especiais, conforme citado no texto. Então, por meio de professor Innis, eu cito aqui a passagem que ele traz de Dewey. Imagens e ideias nos chegam não por propósito determinado, mas em flashes. E flashes são intensos e iluminadores. Eles nos incendeiam apenas quando estamos livres de preocupações especiais. Lembro, sobre esse aspecto, como a filosofia da arte do romantismo alemão, nas figuras exemplares de Schelling e Schopenhauer, afirmam que a experiência estética genuína nasce de uma relação desinteressada com respeito ao mundo em sua faticidade. Entendo esse desinteresse como uma espécie de abandono do tempo objetivo, no qual sempre se inserem nossos objetos de desejo, e com eles, nossa relação conceitual com o mundo. Essa relação nos retira do presente, onde possivelmente possa estar algo novo, que, para ser percebido, exige o abandono do nosso interesse mundano. Não seria mais lógico esse conceito de desinteresse factual do que estar livre de preocupações, expressão que remete a questão para uma linguagem psicológica? Acho que a psicologia tem pouco ou quase nada a contribuir para a questão da criatividade, que me parece mais adequada a uma abordagem ontológica, tal como, a propósito, poderia ser inspirada pela filosofia realista de Peirce. Uma vez mais, quero dizer que o texto do professor Innis me foi profundamente inspirador e me trouxe especial prazer de leitura, como, aliás, costumam ser os textos que ele produz. Retorno a palavra a quem, de fato, vale hoje a pena ouvir, agradecendo ao professor Innis pela sua sempre absolutamente notável participação. Muito obrigado.
Professor Innis, your comments, please. Microphone.
I read the text last night that Eva had sent me for the commentary, and I read it again this morning. So I have had a chance perhaps to think a little bit more, a little longer than one normally would have to make the comments. But the more I thought about it, I realized how the complicated web of not so much objections of how one could continue this type of investigation and what was really happening. And I'd like to make several points. First of all, about the contrast between theorists and empiricists, the approach to looking for the ideas and the examples of creativity and originality, and at the same time trying to generalize about these categories and where are you going to find a root idea. And I think this raises a question that concerns the temptation to reify creativity and originality. They're not stable structures. If anything, they are more like family resemblances of types of activities where we find ourselves in the presence of something that is new. And the reference to Kant, saying that Kant had solved this whole problem, I think attaches a philosophical, theoretical point to Goethe's distinction there of that it is not epistemological. It's a comment about looking for the array of activities that he himself had found himself engaged in that were clearly not due to any normal power that he had, but the power that he really did have, which was abnormal, the power of synthesizing and being able to speak in his own voice, while at the same time having at his back this wind of prior works. But he never felt himself challenged by them. He found himself simply inspired by them, but never in any attempt to fully imitate them. So I would say the first thing one have to do in talking about these particular issues is to avoid all reification, but to look for family resemblances and activities. And I think this analysis of messy practices would show that we're not dealing with any one thing here. Second point deals with the objection to Dewey's notion of the psychologizing of Dewey's notion and the references to Schopenhauer and aesthetic and dropping our engagement with the world in order to be present to these kairotic events. I don't think Dewey was talking about Schopenhauer's anything that was similar to Schopenhauer's avoidance of daily preoccupations. I think Dewey was talking about conflicting focal points of interest and striving to resolve or to solve any type of construction problem he had, whether it's constructing a text or a dialogue or whatever it would be, that those are not the preoccupations that Schopenhauer was talking about. His were namely that it was an argument against striving, explicitly thinking that you can force an idea to come to completion. And any of us who've ever thrown away text, I think there's probably nobody who's never thrown away, that their wastebasket is filled with more text that they've written than are in their folder will understand what is happening there. But there is another problem that I think is deeply connected with even trying to produce a paper such as I did. But if you've ever looked on, say, if you go on Amazon or some other, or look in a book, any sort of a catalog, under creativity, originality, and books on them, you fall into despair, because in a sense the sets of books would fill a room from floor to ceiling, but with no space in between the piles. And the question is, why is there such an incredible proliferation of materials on this? And I've often read book manuscripts for Cambridge University Press, and because I spent 5 years in Denmark working with cultural psychologists, I got on the dirty list of having to referee all of these books. And they said, you can choose any psychology books you want now as your reward. We're not going to give you any money. And so I simply collected a number of the books on creativity and invention. And it's impossible to pin down what most of the chapters are doing, because each one of them ends up involving a totally different set of categories and concerns. Some are experimental, some are constructive, some are simply heuristic, setting up what one would have to know if one could write a paper about it. So they write a paper about what they do not know how to write about. And I think that leads one to realize that there are multiple dialogical frames that are involved here. And Ivo made a very interesting objection. He said, we don't need the psychologists. We need only, in a certain sense, we can do it on the basis of categories of Peirce's realistic epistemology. But my thing is that the categories operate in consciousness. And if Dewey is right, if he is right, at least about Peirce in this case, and this example, in his paper on Peirce's theory of quality, Peirce's greatest experiment or greatest achievement, according to Dewey, is simply the theory of quality, which. But Dewey was very, very hesitant. In fact, he was more than hesitant. He rejected the categories. In his 1945 paper on Peirce's theory of linguistic science and meaning, he says that he agreed with Peirce's epistemology, but said that the firstness, second, and thirdness, he says, were not happy formulations, were not happy terms. And that, of course, that means that they had two very different metaphysical frameworks. That and Dewey's framework was really not the formal framework you have with Peirce. So I do not know what an exploration of creativity and originality would look like on the basis of the categories, except from Ego's book, where this is a central feature and is also very, very helpful. So there is a task here, I think, to try to resolve how Dewey and Peirce fit together in this business of creativity, and even further on the point of view of aesthetic perception and of aesthetic production. It so turns out that on Thursday, where I have been captured to make a presentation of my own book, which I found even harder to write up than to write the book itself. There is a chapter on Dewey, Peirce, and the theory of quality, and trying to work out the correlations between Peirce's theory of quality and the three categories, and their correlates in Dewey's own aesthetics. And I try to do it with the relationship to certain types of of examples. But I think that's a very long story that would need us sitting around a seminar table, sort of face to face, and not doing it perhaps in this format where we would have more of a give and take and a swing and sway as the conversation would proceed. I do have something though that's connected with the Beethoven example of creative combination, of a kind of creative combination that goes beyond the prior achievements. Since Beethoven fully knew that the musical tradition and the Papa Haydn, et cetera, so we know what was going on there. And it's if I would ask, well, okay, Beethoven's thing is what he says about Beethoven, what the Evo says about Beethoven is very much connected with what Goethe says about the background of all the things that you have read and experienced and what you happen to know. But it's a passage from Pascal's Pensées. It's a very interesting passage, and I would that would be in a sense my parting word here about this. Pascal says in this passage, "Let no one say that I have said nothing new. The arrangement of the material is new. In playing tennis, both players use the same ball, but one plays it better. I would just as soon be told that I have used old words, as if the same thoughts did not form a different argument by being differently arranged, just as the same words make different thoughts when arranged differently." Maybe that is the key to creativity and originality, but we will only know it, I think, when we run into it. But it cannot be foreseen that any particular combination will have that effect of interrupting us and pleasing us by its ingenuity and its novelty.
Okay, we have time for questions. If anyone wants to make a question, please let me know in the chat. We have no inscriptions now, so if you want to make the use of word, Professor Nicolas Guardiano, please.
Thanks. Hey, Bob, thanks for your presentation. And you know that I heard this once before over the summertime, although it sounds like you've developed it a bit. So I just had a couple things. They're brief. First, you mentioned Emerson, and I had mentioned over the summer that you should look at the essay of the poet, where there's a much more full-throated idea, metaphysical, also semiotic, going on there about the creativity of the artist. You referenced the Shakespeare essay, which Emerson is pointing out more the indebtedness of the poet or the artist, but there's more to it. Speaking of that, one phrase that Emerson often comes back to is this idea to receive and impart. And so there you have the attentiveness, which you mentioned as being crucial to Emerson's concept of artistic freedom. But there's also the expressive side to the impart. And there we can think of new forms that the poet is introducing into the world. And in fact, Emerson expresses this in terms of an organic principle, namely metamorphosis, which he got from Goethe. So here's a nice way to think through Emerson's view of creativity as a kind of metamorphic organic process, continuous with the inherently real creativity of the universe. So I just mentioned all this to say that it's more than just reception or attention for Emerson. There's, I think, more we can get out of a view of creativity. You seem to, you're very much emphasizing the kind of indebtedness of art to past forms, past signs, as pre-established signs, practices. But here we could look at also the impart, the expressive, and the new developments that are going on. And the other thing I was going to say was just that I just can't like digest at all when you start off your essay about how there's a demand for originality, because I feel like there's totally the opposite, that the demand by society, including academic societies and non-academic, is conformism and is not originality, and that to find originality is a kind of unique thing for people, you know, to be interested in and to devote their lives to. The great scientists, artists do that. But I find the norm is not a demand for originality so much as it is to be lockstep. Emerson's great line is, no one drops their domino. When you're in company, right, you fulfill this kind of societal norm or character type that is expected of you, right? But we don't dig down into our unique personalities and reach for that. That's the norm. So yeah, I struggle with your kind of existential like starting point. Maybe it's your existential starting point, but it's not mine, and I don't think it was Emerson's either.
Thank you, Nicholas. Professor Innis.
I mean, a good point, but the background of what I'm talking about does not so much deal with the understory that I think I hear in what you're saying about conformism. Society wants, society does not want you not to fit in. Academic departments with their particular forms of rigidity, of making sure that what the party line would happen to be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then going back to Emerson's poet, I used to teach that in my language science and symbols course. And I remember one semester, I had already taught it in the course of part of it in the semester, but at the end, of the course, in the last class, I said, I'm not going to tell you I'm not going to go over everything that we've talked about. I'm not going to try to give you a resume of but I simply read for the whole 75 minutes, big chunks of the poet, and stopped every once in a while and say, you remember this that we talked about? But not that we had talked about the text, we had talked about it, but it wasn't really referenced to that. And so I understand the real background of the poet. You understand it perhaps better than I do. But when I was originally trying to find a way of writing about this topic, the topic came from the American Philosophy Forum, which is a floating seminar that a group of us have every April. 15 of us meet and discuss a topic. And the topic for this past year was freedom and liberation. And you say, what do I have to say about freedom and liberation? What is this, right? You just have this strange topic. So I said, but what really bothers me about it? And I'm saying, well, how can I say something creative about freedom and liberation? Then it became very obvious that I was perplexed by how would you not just give a background sort of history of the freedom, but we had all sorts of different types of papers. So, but when I began to reflect upon it, what struck me was the whole issue of saying something new, saying something so different that it hasn't been said before, and exactly in this particular way. So I read a lot of things, and one of the books that influenced me, but I did not take it up in the talk, is a book by Susan Stewart, who teaches at Princeton, called The Poet's Freedom. And it's the anxiety of influence type of thing that you get with Harold Bloom, the literary critics of every poet wants to kill all prior poets. They want to destroy their voices because their voices is a voice that's an agonistic. It's an agonistic relationship to their predecessors, and I understand that with breaking the frame of a poet will renovate. You cannot reform the sonnet structure, but you can write new sonnets that fit the structure, but they have a specific form of creativity. But what was that creativity be? Perhaps the creativity of a generative image or the configuration of images and whatever it would be. So I understand what you're saying. I mean, it's similar to what we talked about, earlier on in the year in April. But that's the sort of the best answer I could give to that. I mean, I read your book very carefully, and I understand, the background out of which, of what you're saying, and also having heard your talks in Sao Paulo, likewise.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay, Professor André Detienne, it's very nice to see you again in this meeting.
I am so glad to be back to this meeting. Robert, I am also glad to hear your good voice and to see those paintings behind you.
Likewise.
As you quoted Emerson, who says we need to quote all the time, and you made a collage of quotations throughout your presentation that was, I guess, original. It reminded me, that quotation reminded me that there is this balance between determinism and indeterminism within this very topic that you address. Because if Emerson says if to be original, you really have to be really yourself, but then you report exactly what it is that you are experiencing, which would make it original because no one else is who you are. But there is this idea that you have to be a sort of a reflection of what it is that you are, and the unicity of it might be enough for the claim of originality. So there is something deterministic about Emerson's point of view, because you are tied to represent what it is that is in yourself, and that's it. That reminded me somehow from Paul Carus's attack against Peirce. Because Carus in 1893 told Peirce, your greatest mistake is that you are trying to be an original philosopher. And there is no greater crime for a philosopher to be original. And Carus was vehement about this. Why? Because he was much, much troubled by the kind of liberty that Peirce was taking with metaphysics. As far as Carus was concerned, the only thing that a professional philosopher could do was to be the exact mirror of nature's eternal laws, Carus being, of course, a determinist. And he was much afraid that Peirce was creating arbitrary hypostatic abstractions, the main one of which was chance. And so in this case, he's telling Peirce, you should not allow yourself to be creative, because then you become arbitrary, and then your ideas become crazy. And Peirce, of course, did not really like that, and so that is pushing it too far. And Peirce was not naive about creativity. He did not really believe in flashes of insight. There is this wonderful quotation from 1905 where he says, the really fine thinking is done in seconds, but hours must prepare for them, and many more hours must seize upon the product of these seconds and utilize it. As far as Peirce was concerned, being an original thinker was not itself an issue. What was the issue was to in the first place, study an immense amount of time and then try them out, draft after draft after draft, even if it is trying out simply a brand new notation that no one had seen before in logic. One had first to design it and then try again until it worked. And then you could use it and follow, and then do something with it which was highly rigorous and yet highly creative at the same time. It was more, it was, of course, was an indeterminist, but the whole point of indeterminism was to be the source of determinations. It's an active state in which one has to allow for the fact that we cannot really plan what it is that we are going to write or paint. Is going to come, but on the other hand, we are the medium, and the work of the mediator is to transform the indeterminate into something that is determinate, and to that extent, to make something worthwhile for everyone, but that takes a lot of work. So there is this view then that we have to embrace the indeterminism. It will make us say things that to others will sound completely arbitrary, but they are not. Since one follows the path of what it is that is being expressed through us, and what is being expressed through us emanates, first would say, from the dynamic object. We are not uttering, it is the object that is uttering itself through us. Our art is to give it clothing that makes it speak to interpreters in a way that was far more efficient than it could be otherwise. That is my comment, and I'd like to hear what you would think about this.
Professor Innis, please.
I'm not too sure I have any serious comment here, although I do have a thought that came up with, deals with drafts, Purse's drafts, Purse's papers, etc. And for anybody's papers, but of when do you put the pen down? I'll give you an example. Last year, I received an email from a person who said, I read your book, your book on Susan Langer that was published by Indiana University Press 10, 12 years ago. And she said, I'm a painter and a teacher of painting, and I want to write a book about my experience as a painter. So I said, okay. So she came to the house. We set up a date, and so she came to the house, and it turns out she has a PhD in clinical psychology, but has been painting for all these years, etc. And so I said, well, what is this that you want to write? She said, I want to write a book about painting, my experiences in painting. I said, yeah, but there are 100 million books about painting. What is going to be your book? Well, my experience, the type of things that I taught my students. And I said, yeah, but you have made your living as a clinical psychologist. So what do you want it to be? She said, well, it will talk about Goldheim. And she went through all these academic literatures. I said, but you're not an academic writer under these circumstances. You should be writing out of your own experience. And she says, yes. So 10 drafts later, she still has, I think I finally got her to get on the platform of where the train will pick her up and take her further. But she's incredibly talented as a painter, and she sells paintings for mega thousands of dollars. So it's not that she doesn't have the skill. And I said, what you really have to write about is something similar to Marion Milner's book on not being able to paint, which is a classic book that Milner wrote about the nature of creative action. And I said, but you don't want to write her book. You want to write your book. And she said, yeah. And then she sent me another draft. I said, no, that's not it. I said, your problem and the problem, everything you say is connected with one central issue. When do you stop painting? When do you put the brush down? At what point have you made that last stroke? And that's it. On this particular one, that last place. And I said, and at what point, when you make that last stroke, do you ruin what you've just done? And she said, yeah, that is a problem. I said, well, that's the problem that I think that you could really illuminate by going further than Marion Milner did in her book. And I think it's the same with philosophical writing or any other type of writing. When do you say it's okay? I can release it. I'm released from it. I've said everything I can say about this topic, or in the way that, but if you have this continuous self-correction process, which is part of creativity, right? Because in a sense, you will know it when you've arrived at it, or perhaps you will never know it. You'll be dead and somebody else will find it and realize this is the most creative piece of work that somebody's ever done, right? Or sets of hidden paintings, right? So how do you handle the ending problem in this process? When do you have this insight that I've said it, there's nothing more to say about it in the context in which I am making my attempts to articulate? And I think that's one of the core theses, or one of the core elements that was in my paper, namely that you cannot foresee the endpoint in any definite way. But it's like one of the Supreme Court justices when he was asked to define pornography, and he said, "Well, can you define pornography? How can you vote on it if you can't define it?" And he said, "I can't define it, but I know it when I see it." And in a certain sense, it's the same perhaps with academic writing. You sort of, know that you've exhausted your voice, right? Or I don't know whether you could say you've exhausted the topic, but those of us who've sat on tenure committees, I was a chairperson for many years. It was like a horrible prison term, but also on sitting on all the promotion and tenure types of things, who was going to be given permanent jobs, and looking at the resumes and the types of work, etc. It becomes a horrible problem that puts people in ways in which they could say things that were really creative, but they wrecked it by trying to be creative, and this is because they thought that this was what was being demanded of them in some false way. It turns out to be a strange mirror image of trying to fit in, of being reduced to fitting into a specific type of frame. But that would be just, these are just some comments connected with one part of what you were saying.
Thank you, Robert. I had that question once to my wife, who is an artist. When do you know when you finish a painting? And then she answered, when I feel I need to start a new one.
When I feel what? That
I need to start a new one. She meant I will continue it in another painting.
That's very interesting. Because of you, I mean, I think there's a lot of writing examples that would fit that. Why are you working on something else? Well, because the other one, I can't take it any further at the moment, right? Or I have lost interest in it, and then you come back to it. There are gazillions of examples of some of Merleau-Ponty's manuscripts were found in his desk drawer, and he had put them away. They were very almost completed texts, and they were found, and he sort of. And every once in a while, you will find somebody in the preface to a book said, "I found this manuscript. I've totally forgotten I had written it," right? And then it turns out to be something that was left aside, I think, because they realized that there was nothing more to say, until they realized then there was something more to say. But I think Eva would say this is connected with the psychological side of creativity and invention, and that would be for the literary historians or for the aesthetically interested psychologists to deal with the relationship between finishing a draft, forgetting a draft, destroying a draft, and all these other things. I'm sure some psychologists group are out there are doing statistical studies of percentage of destroyed manuscripts that have been thrown out in frustration. Creativity as an antidote to frustration, or frustration as the cure for creativity.
Thank you. Professor Colapietro, it's very nice to see you again also.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Robert, for an exquisite paper, and Ivo for a commentary worthy of the paper. Quickly on originality. Peirce actually has a subtle, complex position, as everybody I imagine knows. So with Karras, he's pushing back on something, but with William James, when James is praising the originality of Peirce's categories, Peirce says, if you could prove they are as original as you say they are, they would be false. Originality is not what I'm going after. So Peirce actually has a very complex relationship. I have Milner here. I think this is a great book. Thank you for recommending it, Bob. So I wonder if originality is not like happiness. I mean, if you aim at happiness directly, you're going to make yourself miserable. If you forget the happiness and immerse yourself in some activity, the prospects of becoming happy are much higher. And so originality is not necessarily something we aim directly at, but we cannot help but be original and novel if we give ourselves in humility to the subject. So I think that's Peirce's position. Actually, I think it's a humility before the subject that necessarily drives us toward originality, not because we're striving to, but we have to be ever more faithful to the subject.
That's a very good response. That is faithful to the subject. That is starting over is still continuing on.
Right.
So in Peirce's case, starting over meant to continue on. So there was this hysteresis of pulling the prior achievements forward. So at the end, I think in a certain sense, what happened in a large scale with people like Peirce or the people with these monstrous sets of documents and their files, etc., occurs in miniature with many of us. And even in pedagogical situations where you rework a 15-week course in a way that the same thing is there, but it's combined in a totally different way. And so you say, how does somebody teach the same course for 15 consecutive times without jumping off a bridge, right? And there are ways, I guess, to do it. But I think in Peirce's case, we have very substantial evidence of creativity as practiced in that particular way, of cumulatively starting over, or sometimes not cumulatively, of starting in a different direction, and arriving at a point of intersection, at which point the topic would take over.
I was also thinking about Ivo's example with Beethoven, but if we shift examples, which is a very interesting, important point, but if we shift our example to Shakespeare, by some estimates, he introduced 1,200 new words into English. So it's not just, if he's our example, it's not just rearranging words already in place, but it's actually inventing words that catch on. Or not.
Yeah, or not, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, once they're there, they don't disappear. They're just, they're latent in the repertoire of the language. I mentioned that at the end of my talk, I talked about Alain Grimaud, and there's all I can do is recommend, but what Bach Chaconne in D minor is one of the greatest pieces of music ever written for solo violin, etc. It's a stupendous piece. Busoni, Federico Busoni, the Italian composer, did a reconstruction of it. He reconstructed it for piano. So it's there is a performance on YouTube where she's in Berlin, where the Berlin Philharmonic plays this large music hall, and she walks out and she's in the center stage. She's totally exposed. I mean, there's no place to hide. She gives this rendition of the Chaconne, of Busoni's reconstruction or reconfiguration of Chaconne in a way that is totally unique in comparison to other pianists' performance of it. But you really, when you hear it, you know it's Bach, but it's never been played like that before. The structure there, the form, the latent form is there. The notes are combined. No new notes are introduced. It's just that the whole expressive form is permeated by Hélène Grimaud's touch. Her touch is there. She's not combining anything in a new way other than the touch. But she follows Busoni completely. So she makes Busoni make Bach present, because Bach is not lost in Busoni's reworking of the score. So when you hear, say, for example, hey, Jeremy Denk or somebody else, some other pianist perform this Busoni's version of Bach's Chaconne, you can identify the signature. But you say, this is Denk, this is Busoni, and this is Bach. So you have these three levels. Now, is it purely an accident, or is the issue of touch very similar, say, to what you have in, and Lucia could speak to this perhaps in another way, in another context, of the painter's touch, the person who where we can identify a painting even if it's not signed, etc. That there is a signature that is there. And in my talk on Thursday, I'm going to use an example. I'll show you the image of two paintings by Giorgione that are confronted in two different ways. But in the one case, it's Giorgione's painting The Sunset, and I don't want to spill the beans, but it deals with, this painting has been partially repaired, and the repairing of it becomes the part of the encounter with this painting. But the person experiencing the painting doesn't really know that it's been repaired. So as a result, gives it a totally different meaning, because the repairers, because of the state of the canvas, this is what the art historians know, that because of the state of the canvas, they had to paint over certain sections with the kind of pigment that they had available. So they put in two figures that didn't even appear in the original painting. But the restorers knew that nobody would be fooled by what this was. So I think that the case that that Vincent has brought up, and the others is really connected with how you have identity through change, but where the identity of thought, the signature of thought, say Peirce's signature of thought, the tone of those manuscripts, of those different versions, are not just in terms of the content, but in terms of the forms of repetition between one stage and another. But then you end up with something at the end point is really creative, just as it would be in playing a piece of music in a novel way, or breaking the frame, say, which Stravinsky and the atonal and Schoenberg and the Alban Berg and the others who and the Viennese school of the early part of the last century.
Do not forget Mahler.
Do not forget
Mahler, Gustav Mahler. Gustav Mahler. Do not forget Gustav Mahler.
Yeah. I never forget Mahler. Neither do you. I mean, Mahler he's so close to our hearts. I mean, I even have there is a piece that his instructions that I said that Mariana should play at my funeral. So she has a Mahler, something from Mahler that she has been assigned. Unfortunately, I wouldn't be there to hear it for the last time but I would, Mahler is of course is an example, but he changed the structure. He changed the structure of the symphony of how it could be assembled in a way that broke part of that frame. But the frame that was broken by the Schoenbergs and the others and Weber and the others is a different type of breaking. So there
actually he changed the hierarchy among the instruments. He highlighted a lot. For example, the horns. The horns they were a kind of secondary instruments, and then in the symphonies, the Mahler symphony, they are practically the main solists of the whole orchestra.
Yes,
it's interesting because the way you manage such a hierarchy among the instruments, you can create a new sound, a new structure, and so on. How he highlighted, for example, harp and small flutes. It's interesting how you can manage the same material, but in different order, in different hierarchy.
That's exactly the point. That's perfect.
Yeah.
That's exactly the point. And this, what are we doing now? We're actually giving exemplifications. And why are we grouping these particular things together? There has to be some affinity of overlapping functions between painting and writing and philosophical writing and orchestration and placement in the orchestra. All of these things are exemplifications of not of messy practices, because you would find out that this manuscript doesn't work, or this particular seating of the orchestra doesn't work. So you try another thing. So it's not so instantaneously you would find it, but you think it through. And by the self-correcting process, you arrive at something that seems to fit.
Yeah.
And
okay.
That you're surprised often by, you're surprised that it works. So it's not as if say, oh, look what I did. I found this out. In a certain sense, when you find something out, you're found out. It's you who are found out, because if you're doing it, why are you surprised? How are you surprised that it clicked? Because it didn't occur without you, but it didn't necessarily occur because of you. It occurred with you, with your processes. And that's the part I meant by talking about my friend on putting the brush down or putting the pen down. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as Thomas Aquinas, who had a mystical vision and said, I'll never write anymore. He put his pen down and he never wrote anything else, right? He was surprised by something totally different, and experienced that there was nothing more to say on his side. And in a certain sense, that happens to, I think, to writers, it happens to philosophers. I've had my say. And there's nothing more that I have to say. There might be certain things, then you say, well, you might not want to say it, but there are people who need to hear this that would be important for them. And you might, philosophers or whoever, writers might hear, here's my own other contribution, but that would be something perhaps best discussed at in a bar at 10:30 at night with a second round of beers or something, where people are trying to figure out where's my voice taking me, right? And how do I continue my voice? Should I, try to continue my voice? And I think those are existential issues that all of us face, of saying, no, I've had it. I'm not going to any more conferences. I'm not preparing any more papers. I'm going to sit at home and read all these novels that I wanted to read and the history of X, Y, and Z. And I've had it. So but it's clearly most of us are not in that condition. We're here still working. We're doing whatever we can because we are pulled in a certain way. And I think Emerson was clearly pulled, and Goethe was pulled, and Mahler was pulled, and all the cases of poets that Susan Stewart talks about in The Poet's Freedom are connected with this, not just this agonistic relationship where you want to make a mark and oppose your ancestors, such as Harold Bloom's of the anxiety of influence. I'm going to kill all prior poets. I'm going to write poetry in such a way that I will destroy the past history of poetry. Poetry will start from me, or philosophy will start from me. No, philosophy will continue on as a conversation. I know one of the communication sections has a lot of stuff on Rorty, on continuing the conversation. But I think it goes deep into all of us of how do you find that extra turn that makes something new for you, and conceivably in another way for others. And but that means also that you have to realize that maybe you don't have one voice, maybe you have multiple voices. So maybe one of the insights is to relinquish, say, a prior voice and start in a different way. Starting over again is also a form of originality, rather than continuing just along one path. But those that are choices that are defined by one's Sitzleben, by your own existential structures, and how much existential capital you have invested, and what you have been doing.
Okay, I think that Professor David Dewart wants to make a commentary.
Thank you. A quick one, and it could be addressed both to Bob and to Ivo. Simply, how deep is Peirce's bottomless lake? Now I'll ask another question, which allow me to get into a brief comment on the Dewey and the, let's say, the Emerson and Peirce connection. Isn't the bottomless lake itself a metaphor for the Platonic world? If so, that takes Dewey with his phenomenological description or his psychological description out of the play. So we're into metaphysical discussion.
No.
And the poet, for example, and Emerson said, beauty is the creator of the universe. That too is the something to do with the Platonic world, or and was Dewey as conspicuous for rejecting Peirce, as you pointed out, in that 1945 article rejecting the qualities, and he rejected Whitehead, who had this theory of the ingression of eternal objects, because Dewey wanted only emergent naturalism. He was an emergent naturalist, didn't believe in this Platonic side. So back to the question, how deep is Peirce's bottomless lake? I don't think, you just think about that. It's too deep for Dewey.
You think it was deep or too deep for Dewey, or too? I don't know whether Dewey knew. I think we would have to be speaking for Dewey here for whatever reason, but I can't imagine that Dewey ever heard that expression from Peirce.
Well, because the famous, as Ivo pointed out, that the important passage in Peirce, the bottomless lake. But how bottomless or topless is this lake? It's way beyond Dewey's ballpark. I'm suggesting here.
Yeah.
I'm interested in at the end of Ivo's comment, he did make a point about he wants to get into a ontological discussion, not just a psychological discussion.
Yeah.
Dewey doesn't get beyond a psychological discussion. It reminds me of my colleagues in my department. They're all phenomenologists, and they're all describing experience phenomenologically. Anyway, that's what I have to say.
No, I mean that's a super interesting comment there. It's assuming that the Platonic, I mean, obviously with Emerson, the Neoplatonic background is there. I mean, it's completely obvious and clear, etc. And even part of the Platonian psychology, etc. Those things are there too, and etc. With the theory of forms and emanation and the whole notion of traces and emblems and etc. It's there. That world was clearly not Dewey's world, and it's a different. Dewey's vision of metaphysics is, of course, of one of trying to work out the generic straits of a universe in flux, of how particular forms of order, oases of order emerge, and how they're stabilized and then perish. So the universe, as you know, is precarious and stable. So Dewey, from that point of view, is writing. Perhaps he's riding on the lake of consciousness rather than swimming through it. Right? He's sort of paddling on the surfaces. He's moving, but I think we have to be careful not to sort of flatten Dewey's psychology or his sense of the complexity. When he talks about the parallel between the sculpture who's working on external matter but also the notion of inner materials, the complications of inner materials, Dewey did not really go into either the metaphysical, ontological background of it, or even to go into any sort of deep psychological detail. He pointed in many of the examples in Art as Experience and other places toward these complexities, but they're psychic complexities. They're not expressions or outcomes of metaphysical or ontological activity to a degree that I fully understand. I understand that.
Okay, there is no more questions. I would like to say thank you for everybody, especially Professor Robert Innis for his wonderful conference. And I ask Professor Ivo to make the final considerations and advice. Thank you, guys.
Professor David is trying to say something.
No, I'm going into sudden illumination, as I say in Zen, because the sun is
You
on
are
my.
trying to create some shadow.
I'm holding up a hat to kind of prevent some of the illumination.
Thank you to everyone, especially to Professor Bob Innis, always brilliant and quite lucid and erudite. And thanks to Vincent as well for his intervention, and thanks to Nick and to Professor David and to everyone. It was a very rich session, and this subject is so complex in my view, and I hope we have some moment next year to resume this subject and face to face to resume it and to drive into the deepness of creativity and originality, which has many approaches depending on the philosophical school and the authors and so on. And Sam, I thank you, and let's continue sometime face to face. I'd like to remember everyone that tomorrow morning there will be a session of communication. As you can see in the program. In the morning, and in the afternoon, there will be a very interesting roundtable from the Colombian School of Cursus Mathematics. It's a very strong team, and a roundtable among 4 of them, commanded by Fernando Zolamea. And then after in the sequence, Vincent lecture commented by our Lucia Santaella. Then pay attention to the program, and we are waiting to everyone tomorrow. Okay, thank you very much.
Ivo?
Yes, I'm here.
What's the time difference at this time of year?
2 hours.
2 hours.
Yeah. Which is what hour is it now for you?
It's about 3:45.
3:45. Here is 5:45.
Okay.
So.
But Vinny is supposed to teach.
Actually 5:42.
Right. Okay. So it's 2 hour difference.
2 hours difference.
Okay.
So,
I'm sorry, I was confused about the time.
Vincent's Conferencia is at noon. It's at 2:30.
2:30.
First. That's at 12:30 our time.
Okay.
So 2:30 minus 2 hours is 12:30.
Yeah.
Is there any expectation to change this difference? No.
It just changed. It changed on Saturday night. Sunday
Saturday night, we went off of daylight time.
Yeah.
So 2 hours.
Okay. Very good. I loved that session. Thank you, both of you. It was very good.
Okay. Thank you, Vincent. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Yeah.
Bye.